In 1974, a mother in suburban Ohio spent one Sunday afternoon cooking 14 dinners at once. She stacked them in the chest freezer in her garage, the big white one that hummed next to the lawnmower, and for the next 2 weeks, she never once panicked at 5 o'clock. Number 19 on this list was the meal that fed more American families on busy weeknights than any restaurant ever did. Number 4 could be pulled from the freezer and put on the table without even thawing. These 25 dinners were built for one thing: survival of the 6 o'clock scramble. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down. Number 25, tuna noodle casserole. This was the freezer workhorse of the 1970s, the dish that lived in more avocado green Tupperware than anything else in America. A mom would boil a bag of egg noodles, drain them, and fold them together with 2 cans of tuna, a can of cream of mushroom soup, a splash of milk, and a handful of frozen peas. She spread it into a foil pan, crushed a sleeve of potato chips or a handful of crushed cornflakes over the top, and instead of baking it, she covered it tight with foil and slid it straight into the freezer. A can of tuna cost about 39 cents in 1973. The whole casserole fed a family of 5 for under $2. On a Tuesday when the kids had baseball and homework and nobody had time to think, she pulled it out, baked it at 350 degrees for an hour, and dinner appeared like magic. The chips browned. The noodles drank up the sauce. Nobody knew it had been made 3 weeks earlier. Number 24, Salisbury steak with gravy. This was the homemade answer to the frozen TV dinner, and it was better in every way. A mom mixed a pound of ground beef with breadcrumbs, an egg, minced onion, and a shake of Worcestershire, then shaped it into oval patties that looked almost like real steak. She browned them fast in a skillet, made a brown gravy from the drippings, flour, and a crumbled beef bouillon cube, and layered the patties and gravy into a shallow pan. Frozen flat, they stacked beautifully. Ground beef ran about 79 cents a pound in the mid-70s, which made this an elegant-looking dinner for almost nothing. Reheated with the foil on, the patties stayed tender, and the gravy went silky again. Served over mashed potatoes or buttered egg noodles, this was the meal that made a weeknight feel like a small occasion. Kids who turned up their noses at the Swanson version cleaned their plates when Mom made it herself. Number 23, chicken pot pie. Long before you could buy a frozen pot pie in a box, every organized mom made her own by the half dozen. She simmered chicken until it fell off the bone, then folded the meat into a thick sauce of butter, flour, and milk, studded with frozen peas, carrots, and diced potato. She poured it into pie tins lined with pastry, laid a top crust over each one, crimped the edges, and froze them unbaked in stacks separated by wax paper. A whole stewing hen cost about 45 cents a pound and produced enough filling for 3 pies. When one came out of the freezer, she brushed the top with egg, cut a couple of steam vents, and baked it straight from frozen for nearly an hour until the crust turned deep gold and the filling bubbled up through the slits. The smell filled the whole house by 6. It looked like she had spent all afternoon. She had spent 20 minutes 3 weeks ago. Number 22, Sloppy Joes. The freezer version of this was pure genius because the messy part was already done. A mom browned 2 or 3 pounds of ground beef with chopped onion and green pepper, stirred in ketchup, mustard, brown sugar, and a can of tomato sauce, and let it simmer until it thickened into that sweet, tangy, spoonable filling. Then she ladled it into freezer containers or even freezer bags laid flat. Ground beef was cheap, buns were a dime a package, and a single batch made enough for 2 dinners. On a chaotic evening, she thawed a bag in a pot on the stove, toasted the buns, and dinner was ready in the time it took to set the table. There was no shame in it and no complaint at the table, because sloppy joes were what happiness tasted like when you were 9 years old. The filling reheated even better than the day it was made, the flavors having settled into each other in the cold. Number 21. Swiss steak. This was how a mom turned the cheapest, toughest cut of beef into something that fell apart under a fork. She took round steak, pounded flour into it with the edge of a saucer or a meat mallet, browned it hard in a skillet, then smothered it in a sauce of canned tomatoes, onion, and celery. Instead of the long, slow braise that Swiss steak usually demanded, she froze it raw in the sauce, letting the freezer and the eventual reheat do the tenderizing work. Round steak cost far less than a roast, and this stretched it across a whole family. Pulled from the freezer and baked low and slow in a covered dish, the meat went meltingly soft, and the tomato sauce reduced into something rich and deep. Served over rice or mashed potatoes, it was the kind of dinner that tasted like it took all day. And it had, just not today. Number 20. Baked ziti. Italian-American families across the Northeast turned this into their number one freezer meal, and for good reason. A mom boiled a box of ziti, tossed it with jarred or homemade tomato sauce, layered it with ricotta, mozzarella, and grated Parmesan, and packed the whole thing into a foil pan. Covered tight, it went into the freezer where it waited for the busiest possible night. A box of pasta cost 25 cents. A pan of ziti fed a crowd and reheated as if it had just come out of the oven. She would often make two at once, one for the freezer and one to bring to a neighbor who had a new baby or a death in the family, because that was how the neighborhood worked. Baked from frozen with foil on, then uncovered for the last 15 minutes to brown the cheese, it emerged bubbling at the edges and stringy in the middle. Sunday effort, Wednesday delivery. Number 19. Hamburger stroganoff. Here is the meal that quietly fed more American families on weeknights than almost anything else in this era. It was the poor man's version of the fancy beef stroganoff in the ladies' magazines, and honestly, it was better. A mom browned ground beef with onion and sliced mushrooms, stirred in a can of cream of mushroom soup, then folded in sour cream right at the end so it turned into a rich, tangy sauce. She froze the sauce flat in a bag, holding back the noodles for the night she served it. Ground beef and a can of soup cost almost nothing, and sour cream was the only splurge. On a busy night, she thawed the sauce, boiled a pot of egg noodles, and poured one over the other. 10 minutes, start to finish. It was creamy, savory, and filling in that specific way that made kids ask for seconds and husbands ask what restaurant she'd been hiding it from. It came from her freezer. It always had. Number 18. Individual meatloaves. A smart mom figured out that meatloaf froze better in small portions than in one giant brick. She mixed her usual pound and a half of ground beef with breadcrumbs, egg, onion, and a slug of ketchup, then pressed the mixture into muffin tins instead of a loaf pan. Once frozen solid, she popped the little loaves out and stored them in a bag, pulling out exactly as many as she needed on any given night. This meant no leftover half-loaf drying out in the fridge, and it meant they baked in 20 minutes instead of an hour because they were so much smaller. Each one got its own cap of ketchup or tomato sauce before it went in the oven. For a family where the kids ate at different times because of practice and lessons and shift work, this was the answer. Everybody got a hot, homemade meatloaf whenever they walked in the door. Nobody ever suspected it had been portioned out weeks in advance. Number 17. Chicken divin. This was the dinner party dish that moms learned to freeze so it could double as a weeknight lifesaver. Broccoli spears laid in a pan, sliced cooked chicken over the top, and a sauce of cream of chicken soup, mayonnaise, a squeeze of lemon, and a little curry powder poured over everything, then blanketed with shredded cheddar and breadcrumbs. It sounds fancy, and it looked fancy on the table, but the ingredients were pantry staples and frozen broccoli that cost $1 a box. Assembled and frozen unbaked, it waited for the night the boss came to dinner, or the night nobody had a single minute to spare. Baked from the freezer until the cheese browned and the sauce bubbled up around the broccoli, it came out looking like something from a country club buffet. This was the 1970s in one casserole dish, a little bit of showing off, built entirely out of shortcuts and cans, and absolutely delicious. First pattern break. Here is where the story of the 1970s freezer dinner gets interesting, because this was not really about food. It was about time. The 1970s was the decade when American mothers went back to work in enormous numbers. The two-income household stopped being the exception and started becoming the rule. But the expectation that a real, hot, sit-down dinner would appear on the table every single night did not change. So women did something extraordinary. They collapsed a week's worth of cooking into a single Sunday afternoon. They bought chest freezers and put them in garages and basements, and they filled them like squirrels, filling a hollow tree before winter. This was not laziness, and it was not defeat. It was engineering. It was a woman looking at a Tuesday that included a full workday, a PTA meeting, and a sick kid, and deciding in advance that her family would still eat well. The freezer was her secret weapon against a clock that never stopped. Number 16. Enchilada casserole. As Mexican-American cooking spread from the Southwest into kitchens across the whole country, this became a freezer favorite from Texas to Michigan. A mom browned ground beef, layered it with corn tortillas, canned enchilada sauce, and a mountain of shredded cheese, building it like a lasagna in a foil pan. It froze beautifully and reheated even better, the tortillas soaking up the sauce until the whole thing held together like a savory cake. A can of enchilada sauce cost around 30 cents, and a pound of beef stretched across a 9x13 pan that fed the whole family with leftovers. Baked from frozen with foil on, then finished uncovered to crisp the cheese on top, it came out gooey and rich and just spicy enough. Served with a dollop of sour cream and maybe some shredded lettuce on the side, it turned an ordinary weeknight into something that felt a little bit like a fiesta. Kids requested it by name. Number 15. Beef stew. The freezer was the perfect home for a big pot of stew, because stew only improves with age and cold. A mom browned cheap chuck roast cut into cubes, then simmered it with potatoes, carrots, onions, celery, and a beef broth base, thickened just slightly with flour. She let it cool completely, then ladled it into containers and froze it in family-sized portions. Chuck was one of the least expensive cuts at the butcher, and a single pot produced 2 or 3 dinners. On a cold, busy night, she thawed a container and heated it slowly on the stove while she helped with homework at the kitchen table. The flavors, having sat frozen for weeks, had married into something deeper and rounder than fresh stew ever tasted. Served with bread and butter or biscuits from a can, it warmed a family from the inside out. This was the dinner that made a February evening bearable, pulled straight from the cold and set steaming on the table. Number 14. Chicken and rice casserole. This was the ultimate dump and freeze dinner, and nearly every mom had a version of it. Raw rice went in the bottom of the pan, chicken pieces on top, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a can of cream of chicken soup poured over, plus a soup can of water and a sprinkle of dried onion soup mix. That was it. She covered it, froze it, and forgot about it. When she baked it from frozen, low and slow and covered tight, something remarkable happened. The rice absorbed all the liquid and all the chicken flavor, cooking right there in the pan into a creamy, tender bed under fall-off-the-bone meat. It required no browning, no boiling, no thinking. Chicken thighs cost half of what breasts did, and this dish rewarded the cheaper dark meat with richer flavor. For a mom who was exhausted before she even got home, this was the dinner that asked absolutely nothing of her except to turn on the oven. Number 13, stuffed cabbage rolls. In Polish, Hungarian, and Ukrainian households across the industrial Midwest, these were a labor of love made in enormous batches, specifically so they could be frozen. A mom softened cabbage leaves in boiling water, then rolled each one around a filling of ground beef, rice, and onion, tucking them into neat little bundles. She lined them up in a pan, covered them in a sweet and sour tomato sauce, and froze the whole tray. The rolling was tedious, which is exactly why nobody wanted to do it more than once a month, and why the freezer made so much sense. Cheap cabbage and a pound of beef produced dozens of rolls. Baked from frozen, low, and slow, the cabbage went silky, and the rice inside plumped up, and the tomato sauce reduced into something tangy and rich. This was Sunday food that could show up on a Wednesday, carrying with it the whole weight of a family's heritage in a single, humble bundle. Number 12, twice-baked potatoes. These were the freezer trick that made an ordinary side feel like a restaurant treat, and moms made them by the dozen. She baked a whole tray of potatoes, split them, scooped out the insides, and mashed the fluffy centers with butter, sour cream, cheddar, and chives. Then she piled the mixture back into the skins, arranged them on a sheet, and froze them solid before bagging them up. A 5-pound bag of potatoes cost under $1 and made a small mountain of them. On a busy night, she pulled out exactly as many as she needed and baked them from frozen until the tops browned and the cheese melted into the fluffy filling. Paired with those individual meatloaves from earlier, or a couple of Salisbury steaks, this turned 2 freezer components into a complete, impressive-looking dinner in under half an hour. Kids fought over them. Nobody realized the hardest part had been done weeks before on a lazy Sunday. Number 11, lasagna. If baked ziti was the everyday freezer pasta, lasagna was its Sunday best cousin, and it was arguably the single most famous make-ahead dinner of the entire decade. A mom layered noodles, meat sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella into a deep foil pan, building it high, then wrapped it tight and froze it flat. It was work, no question, which is exactly why she made 2 at a time. A pan of lasagna could feed 8 people or one family for 2 nights, and it cost a fraction of what a restaurant charged. Baked from frozen, covered for well over an hour, and then uncovered to bubble and brown, it emerged as the centerpiece any table would be proud of. This was the dish a mom pulled out when company dropped in unexpectedly, when a neighbor needed comforting, or when she simply could not face the stove but still wanted her family to eat like royalty. The freezer made a queen out of every tired cook. Number 10, porcupine meatballs. Kids loved the name, and moms loved that they froze like a dream. These were meatballs made with raw rice mixed right into the ground beef, so that as they cooked, the rice grains swelled and poked out in all directions like tiny quills. She browned them, or sometimes skipped even that, and froze them in a tomato sauce that would finish cooking the rice during the reheat. Adding rice to the beef stretched a single pound into enough meatballs to feed everybody, which was the whole quiet point. A can of tomato soup or tomato sauce cost pennies and made the perfect braising liquid. Pulled from the freezer and simmered low until the rice was tender and the sauce had thickened, these were hearty, cheap, and just novel enough that children actually got excited about dinner. Served over more rice or with mashed potatoes, they were a weeknight staple that stretched a tight grocery budget while still landing something warm and homemade on the table. Number 9. Chicken tetrazzini. This was the elegant way to use up leftover holiday turkey or a cheap boiled chicken, and it froze wonderfully. A mom tossed cooked pasta with diced chicken, mushrooms, and a creamy sauce built from butter, flour, chicken broth, and a little sherry if she was feeling fancy, then topped it with Parmesan and breadcrumbs. Packed into a pan and frozen, it waited for a night when she needed dinner to feel like more than it cost. The genius was that the most expensive ingredient, the meat, was often free, salvaged from a carcass that would otherwise have been thrown out. Baked from frozen until the top turned golden and the sauce bubbled at the edges, it came out creamy and rich and studded with tender bites of chicken. This was the dish that let a thrifty mom turn Thursday's leftovers into the following Wednesday's dinner party, with nobody at the table ever suspecting the humble origins of what sat on their plate. Second pattern break. Here is something the frozen food companies did not want American mothers to notice. Every single one of these homemade freezer dinners was a direct threat to their business. Because if a mom spent one Sunday filling her chest freezer with 14 real dinners, she did not need to buy 14 TV dinners at the grocery store. Swanson, Banquet, and Stouffer's spent enormous sums in the 1970s convincing women that store-bought frozen meals were the modern, liberated choice, the smart shortcut for the busy contemporary family. And they were convenient, no argument. But a homemade chicken pot pie cost a quarter of what a store-bought one did, tasted infinitely better, and contained food a mother could actually name. The frozen dinner aisle was selling convenience that women already knew how to make themselves, for less, in their own kitchens. The chest freezer in the garage was not just an appliance. It was independence. It was a mom refusing to pay a corporation to do something she could do better on a Sunday afternoon with a package of ground beef and a stack of foil pans. Number 8. Ham and scalloped potatoes. After Easter or Christmas, when a big ham had been picked down toward the bone, a resourceful mom turned the leftovers into a freezer meal that stretched the holiday for weeks. She layered thinly sliced potatoes with chunks of ham and onion, poured a creamy sauce of milk, butter, and flour over the top, and froze the whole casserole before baking. The ham was already paid for, essentially free, salvaged from a dinner that had happened days earlier. A few potatoes and some milk turned those scraps into an entirely new meal, baked from frozen, low and slow so the potatoes cooked through completely. It emerged bubbling and golden, the potatoes tender and the sauce clinging to every slice. The saltiness of the cured ham seasoned the whole dish without any extra effort. This was thrift as an art form, a mom looking at a stripped ham bone and a bag of potatoes and seeing not leftovers but a hot, complete dinner waiting 3 weeks in the future. Number 7. Beef and bean burritos. As Tex-Mex flavors marched across the country, moms started rolling these by the dozen and freezing them individually wrapped in foil, and it changed the after-school snack and the weeknight dinner forever. She browned ground beef with taco seasoning, mixed it with refried beans and cheese, spooned it onto flour tortillas, rolled them up, and wrapped each one in foil before piling them into the freezer. A can of refried beans cost about 30 cents and stretched a pound of beef into a whole batch. The beauty was the portability. A kid could grab one, unwrap it, warm it in the oven, or, by the end of the decade, that miraculous new microwave, and have a hot, filling meal in minutes without a parent lifting a finger. For a family where everyone came and went on different schedules, these frozen burritos were the ultimate self-serve dinner. Cheap, hearty, and endlessly convenient, they were fast food that came from your own freezer instead of a drive-through window. Number 6. Chili. No dish on this list was more perfectly suited to the freezer than a big pot of chili, because chili, like stew, only gets better with time. A mom browned 2 or 3 pounds of ground beef with onions, dumped in canned kidney beans and canned tomatoes, and seasoned it all with chili powder, cumin, and salt, then let it simmer down into something thick and deep. She cooled it, ladled it into containers, and froze it in generous portions. A single afternoon's pot produced enough for 3 or 4 dinners, and the cost per bowl was almost nothing. Pulled from the freezer weeks later and reheated slowly on the stove, the chili had transformed, the flavors having deepened and merged in the cold into something better than the day it was made. Served over rice, spooned onto hot dogs, ladled over corn chips with cheese, or eaten plain with crackers and a raw onion on the side, one batch of frozen chili solved dinners in half a dozen different ways. Number 5. Salmon loaf. Before fresh fish was something an ordinary inland family could buy, canned salmon was the affordable protein that moms turned into a proper baked dinner, and it froze well before cooking. She mixed canned pink salmon with breadcrumbs, egg, minced onion, and a little lemon, pressed it into a loaf pan just like meatloaf, and froze it raw. A tall can of salmon cost about 60 cents in the mid-70s and fed the whole family. Baked from frozen until it was firm and golden on top, it sliced into neat portions that held together beautifully. The soft, edible bones in the canned salmon added a boost of calcium that nobody thought about, but everybody benefited from. Served with a simple cream sauce or a squeeze of lemon, alongside peas and mashed potatoes, salmon loaf was a Friday night supper that felt a little bit special. It was the dish that let a family eat fish on a budget, prepped in advance and waiting patiently in the cold. Third pattern break. Here is what nobody says out loud about these freezer dinners. They were an act of love disguised as an act of logistics. Think about what it actually meant for a woman to spend her one free Sunday, her only real day of rest in a punishing week, standing at the stove for 6 hours, browning beef and rolling cabbage and lining up foil pans. She was not doing it for herself. She was doing it so that on Thursday, when she walked in the door, exhausted and frazzled and pulled in 10 directions, her children would still sit down to a hot, homemade meal instead of a bowl of cereal or a sad store-bought tray. Every container in that freezer was a message from the past version of herself to the future version, a gift she left for the woman she would be too tired to become on a weeknight. The chest freezer in the garage was full of care, frozen solid, waiting to be thawed exactly when the family needed it most. Number 4. Meatball subs, assembled and frozen. Some moms took it a step further than just freezing meatballs and pre-built the entire sandwich. She made a huge batch of meatballs in marinara, cooled them, tucked a few into a split hoagie roll with a slice of provolone, wrapped the whole thing in foil, and froze it complete. The magic was that it could go from freezer to oven without a single step in between. On the busiest possible night, a kid could grab a foil packet and it baked straight from frozen into a hot, melty, saucy sandwich in about half an hour with zero assembly. Ground beef, a jar of sauce, and a package of rolls made a stack of them for a few dollars. This was the dinner for the night when mom was not even home, when a teenager had to feed a younger sibling, when the schedule had completely fallen apart. A whole hot meal, wrapped and waiting, requiring nothing but an oven and 30 minutes. Number 3. chicken a la king. This creamy, old-fashioned dish was a freezer staple in households that wanted something that felt a touch elegant without any weeknight effort. A mom made a rich sauce of butter, flour, and cream or milk, folded in diced cooked chicken, mushrooms, peas, and little strips of pimento for color, and froze the whole mixture flat in a bag. The chicken was often left over or from a cheap boiled hen, keeping the cost down to almost nothing. On a busy night, she thawed the sauce, heated it gently, and ladled it over toast points, split biscuits, or a puff pastry shell. The pimentos gave it a festive, company-ready look, little flecks of red running through the pale, creamy sauce. It tasted like the kind of ladies' luncheon food served in department store tea rooms, but it came out of a freezer bag in 10 minutes flat. This was how a tired mom served something that looked thoughtful and refined on a night when she had nothing left to give. Number 2, Turkey Tetrazzini's country cousin, the King Ranch chicken casserole. Born in Texas and spread across the whole South and Southwest, this became one of the most beloved freezer casseroles in America. A mom layered torn corn tortillas with shredded chicken, a sauce of cream of chicken soup, cream of mushroom soup, and canned tomatoes with green chilies, and a heavy blanket of shredded cheddar. Built like a lasagna in a foil pan and frozen unbaked, it waited for the church potluck, the family reunion, or the plain old exhausting Tuesday. 2 cans of soup and a can of tomatoes with chilies formed the entire backbone, and leftover chicken did the rest. Baked from frozen until the cheese melted and the whole thing bubbled at the edges. The tortillas softened into the sauce, and the mild chilies gave it just enough warmth to be interesting. This was the casserole that showed up at every gathering below the Mason-Dixon line, hearty and creamy and comforting, and it was born to live in a freezer. Number 1, spaghetti sauce, frozen by the gallon. At the top of this list is the single most important freezer item in the 1970s American kitchen, and it is almost too humble to name. It was not one dinner, it was the foundation of a dozen. A mom would spend a Sunday making an enormous pot of meat sauce, browning pounds of ground beef with onions, garlic, canned tomatoes, tomato paste, and herbs, and simmering it for hours until the whole house smelled of it. Then she froze it in containers and bags, gallons of it, in family-sized portions. A batch this size cost a fraction of buying it a jar at a time, and it turned into meal after meal after meal. Thawed over pasta, it was spaghetti night. Layered into noodles and cheese, it became the lasagna and ziti from earlier on this list. Spooned over a split-baked potato, ladled onto a hot dog, spread on bread with cheese under the broiler for a quick pizza, it was endlessly, infinitely useful. One pot of sauce, frozen away on a single afternoon, quietly solved dinner a dozen different times over the following month. It was the workhorse behind half the meals a family ate. Nothing in that chest freezer did more, cost less, or carried a family further. It was the reason a busy mom in 1974 could face any weeknight and win. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week. Just one. The tuna casserole, the frozen chili, the big pot of spaghetti sauce tucked away for later. Then come back and tell me if your mother wasn't onto something the rest of us forgot. Because these weren't shortcuts. They were a whole way of loving a family, frozen solid and waiting for the moment it was needed most. Drop the one you're going to try in the comments. I want to know if the chicken pot pie gets more love than the King Ranch casserole.